Chicago, 1981. A city of steel and smoke, where the skyline gleamed like knives against the night, and the L train's rattle was a lullaby for the damned. The factories were closing, the jobs were drying up, and the streets were ruled by the desperate. On the south side, the streetlights buzzed over broken glass and whispered secrets to no one in particular. The police scanners never slept. Somewhere in that chaos, evil was learning how to drive. The disappearances started small. Women who lived on the margins. Women whose names the newspapers rarely printed. They were mothers, daughters, survivors. And in Chicago's underbelly, they were invisible. When their bodies began to surface, mutilated in ways that defied comprehension, investigators first blamed drugs, gangs, and the city's growing list of serial predators. Nobody imagined that the horror was mobile, that death itself was cruising the streets in a red van, its doors closing on the last breaths of the forgotten. Behind the wheel sat Robin Gecht, a wiry man with ice behind his eyes and a smile that didn't reach his face. He worked in construction, ran a side business repairing motel rooms, and claimed he once labored under John Wayne Gacy, Chicago's other monster. If you believe the stories, Gecht learned more than carpentry on that job. He learned control. He learned how to make horror look ordinary. With him were Edward Spreitzer and the Kokoraleis brothers, Andrew and Thomas, followers who mistook Gecht's madness for purpose. They called him the real man. He promised them power, women, and communion with something unholy. What he delivered was carnage. Together, they became what papers would later christen the Chicago Ripper Crew. Victims were snatched off the street, bound and tortured in rituals that blended satanic theater with sexual sadism. They used knives, candles, and sometimes crude surgical tools. The killings were systematic, ritualistic mutilations performed with precision and indifference. Some women vanished entirely. Others, like Beverly Washington, survived long enough to describe the horror. A dimly lit van, a small altar, and Gecht's cold voice reciting words that no one should ever hear. By the time police began connecting the dots, the crew had been operating for months, maybe years. Their crimes bled across jurisdictions, Chicago proper, Villa Park, Elmhurst, leaving detectives chasing ghosts. In 1982 alone, the city recorded more than 700 homicides. To the system, these women were just another statistic in a city losing its soul. But beneath the bureaucratic apathy was a pattern, one that would eventually reveal not just a murder spree, but a cult of cruelty led by a man who saw himself as a prophet of pain. And somehow, despite witness testimony, physical evidence, and a trail of blood that led straight to his doorstep, Robin Gecht never served a day for murder. Justice, it seems, has a blind spot when the devil dresses like a working man. We're peeling back the rotted fabric of the Chicago Ripper Crew, a story of power, manipulation, and ritual that turned the streets of a major American city into a sacrificial ground. We'll trace the van's route through the neighborhoods that still carry its ghost, through the investigation that stumbled, and through the legal loopholes that let a killer fade into the cracks. I'm John, and this is Dark Dialogue, where we confront the darkness that hides behind everyday faces and ask why we keep looking away. Tonight, we begin with the beginning, the van, the victims, and the city that didn't realize how close it came to hell. The following episode contains extremely graphic descriptions of violence, sexual assault, mutilation, and ritualistic acts, including cannibalism. These crimes are among the most depraved and disturbing ever discussed on Dark Dialogue and may not be suitable for all listeners. We believe in presenting cases as they truly occurred, not to sensationalize the horror, but to understand the depth of human cruelty, the failures that allowed it to continue, and the lives it destroyed. Listener discretion is strongly advised. These stories are horrifying, but the voices of the victims and the truths behind their suffering deserve to be heard. Hey, Angela, how's it going tonight?
Hey, John, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Yeah, I mean, it's just all so discombobulated, and every time I think we're getting back on track, we get off track again, and so, but...
We got to talk to that track master.
Something.
Yeah.
We got to do something.
Yeah.
All right, well, we ready to jump, dive, slither, crawl into this one?
It feels like Slither is upon us.
Yeah, it's a bit slithery.
Yeah.
So welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue, where we dive deep into the mysteries that haunt small towns and big cities alike. I'm your host, John, and tonight we're heading into Chicago, a city of ambition, grit, and shadow, a place where steel shines on the surface and rots underneath. Angela, you don't know this case yet. Not really. And honestly, most people don't. But by the end of tonight, you're going to understand why it still chills the city, even decades later. You ready for what we're about to walk into?
Guess as ready as I can be without knowing what's coming, which is hard for me.
This is
all
true.
Know this.
This is true.
I know Chicago in the early 80s was struggling. Crime, corruption, neighborhoods falling apart. But that's about all I've got going in.
Perfect place to start. Because while the city was buckling, 4 men were out there using the chaos as camouflage. And they weren't just killing. They weren't just torturing. They believed what they were doing was ritual, worship, devotion. At the center of it all was a man named Robin Gecht, a construction worker, a family man, a guy who waved to his neighbors and punched a clock every morning, and maybe, just maybe, a former employee of John Wayne Gacy. But behind the normal facade, he was building something truly monstrous. His followers, Edward Spreitzer and brothers Andrew and Thomas Kokoraleis, became his disciples of death. These men prowled Chicago's streets between 1981 and 1982 in a red van, abducting women, mutilating them, and performing rituals so grotesque that even hardened detectives hesitated before describing them.
And I still can't believe Gecht wasn't convicted of a single murder. His followers got life for this, but he somehow skated?
Well, he dodged murder charges, but he didn't skate. What finally put him away wasn't a homicide. So, yeah, he escaped murder convictions, but he didn't escape justice altogether. And that constraint, the man who built the cult versus the men who carried out the slaughter, is part of what makes this case so disturbing. And just like the previous case that we covered of the Simon Sue murders.
Yeah.
Very freaking similar, these two, except this one is way more disturbing. So over the next 4 episodes, we're pulling this nightmare apart piece by piece. So tonight we're going to talk about the abductions, the early victims, and the Chicago landscape that let these men operate in plain sight. And then we're going to talk about the rest of the victims, their rituals, their methods, the twisted theology that Gecht instilled in his followers. We'll talk about the investigation, the interrogations, the confessions, and how the facade finally cracked. And then finally, the trials and the aftermath, where justice landed hard, but stopped just short of fully unraveling the man at the top.
So this isn't just true crime. It's psychology, sociology, and a warning about what happens when people fall through the cracks.
Exactly. This isn't a ghost story, but it's just as freaking haunting. It's about charisma used as a weapon, belief twisted into brutality, and the price we pay when a city looks away from the women who were already on the margins. I'm your host, John.
And I'm Ange.
And this is Dark Dialogue. Because the past doesn't stay buried, not in Chicago's alleys, and not in the stories of the women who never made it home. Now, Angela, you dug into the location and the area that we're going to be talking about throughout this whole episode. So what can you tell us about Chicago as the 80s began?
What can I tell you indeed? Chicago is synonymous with many things depending on who you ask. The Cubs, the Bulls, the Bears, and the Blackhawks for sports fanatics. Deep dish pizza, Italian beef Sammys, hot dogs, Cracker Jacks, and Tootsie Rolls for the foodies. Lollapalooza and the Chicago Marathon, or perhaps Cloudgate, aka the Bean, which happens to be one of the world's largest permanent outdoor art installations located in Millennium Park. Just might come to mind as well.
Not for me.
I know. But none of those things came to mind. Absolutely none of them.
Deep dish pizza would come to mind.
I was going to say.
And I guess the Chicago Bears.
Bears, yeah.
And I don't know, Al Capone, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Well,
the Great Fire of 1918.
Get to them.
Okay.
I don't do normal, remember?
I understand. No, 100%. That's why you do you.
However, before all of that took place, it needed a home. Chicago was founded in 1837 as a rail and shipping hub, and by 1840, the census reported 4,470 people. Modest beginnings for what it would later become, because by the 1980s, around when our topic tonight took place, the census reported 3,005,072 residents. And oddly, it has reduced to an estimated 2,721,308 Chicagoans residing there now.
There's your demonym.
My demonym. I love it. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 destroyed much of the city.
It was 1871. I said 1918. I was way freaking off, and I knew better than that. Crying out loud.
How dare you?
How was it started? A woman was milking her cow, and the cow knocked over the lantern, and the lantern lit the straw and stuff that was on the barn floor, and the whole freaking town burned down.
Well, damn that cow. It destroyed much of the city, but spurred innovative rebuilding, birthing the first skyscraper, the Home Insurance Building, in 1885. Also resulting of the fire, Queen Victoria donated 8,000 books to help rebuild what was assumed to be a lost library, when in reality, Chicago didn't have a public library, so the Queen essentially created the very first one.
Yeah.
Very nice of her.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. So I'll use that as a little tidbit, as a jumping off point to my favorite part of the location, seeking out the weird and potentially lesser known stories, such as these next ones, because John knows the known stories.
Yeah, well, definitely the crime ones.
Yeah, I go with the lesser known.
Perfect.
In 1897, meatpacking magnate Alfred the Sausage King Lutgert was convicted of murdering his wife Louisa and dissolving her body in a sausage grinding vat at his factory. He served just 3 years before being released for good behavior.
Wow, and I said I knew the crime ones, but I didn't know that story.
Yeah, and good behavior, 3 years.
3 years, yeah.
Nice. In 1915, divers pulled a 40-foot submarine from the Chicago River's bottom, complete with a human skeleton and a dog's bones inside. Dubbed the Fool Killer, it was likely an experimental 19th century lifeboat, but it vanished from a park exhibit in 1916. Its origins still debated.
Huh.
Anybody know where it is? Want to tell us?
The submarine?
Yeah.
Where it is, or where it was from?
It vanished from a park exhibit. Where it is, where it came from, does anybody know? Anybody want to tell?
That's really freaking interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
In 1980, the Suburbs Zoo just outside of Chicago became the first in the world to successfully operate on a gorilla's brain, removing a blood clot from a 7-year-old lowland gorilla named Binti. It saved her life and advanced primate medicine.
Isn't that like your favorite hero's daughter's name?
No, her name is Bindi.
Pretty freaking
He's not
close.
my favorite hero. He's just one of me.
I get an A or a thumbs up or something because I was close.
Thumbs up. There
Okay.
you go.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bindi.
Bendy. Pretty freaking close.
Pretty close. As I laugh. Now let's talk about crime. Since that's why we're here. Chicago experienced a major rise in violent crime in the 1920s, Hello, Al Capone.
Yep.
Another bump in the 60s and again in the 2020s. The most prominent crime categories they face are homicide, armed robbery, gang violence, and aggravated battery. Chicago has a higher murder rate than the larger cities of New York and Los Angeles. However, while it has a large absolute number of crimes due to its size, Chicago is not among the top 25 most violent cities in the United States.
I have a hard time believing that.
I did too.
I think it's probably the way they reported or something, because every weekend, like 40 freaking people get shot in that freaking place.
Yeah. So we have DuPage County that John has also asked me to touch on, which is in the Chicago metropolitan area, about 25 miles west of downtown Chicago. DuPage County is the second most populous county in Illinois, boasting 658,835 residents around the time of this case, with the most recent estimation increasing to 937,184 people. It is described as an affluent county known for high quality of life, excellent public schools, I think 43 of them, and vibrant arts and culture scene. The county seat is Wheaton, which is where the Belushi brothers, John and Jim, grew up.
Right on.
DuPage County is also home to some major players in the science world. Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory, or Fermilab, has operated in the county since 1973 as a hub for high-energy particle physics research, as well as Argonne National Laboratory, one of the U.S. government's oldest and largest science and engineering research laboratories. However, nature enthusiast listeners do not despair, because despite all of the industrial and educational areas, there are still areas to enjoy the outdoors as well. The Forest Preserve District manages over 25,000 acres of prairies, woodlands, and wetlands, with approximately 175 miles worth of trails for hiking and biking. They host events such as pumpkin hikes and haunted tours in October. Of course, I was going to mention that one.
Of course, now that it's over. It's dedicated to preserving flora, fauna, and scenic beauty for public recreation. There you have it. Well, thank you very much for that.
You're so freaking welcome. I can't even handle it.
So we have got like a whole plethora of asshats to talk about.
Let's keep a list.
An asshat list?
An asshat list.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
There will be a test at the end. Not for me.
Asshats?
Not for me and not for you, for our listeners.
Okay. Well, that sounds like a plan to me. The first couple asshats that we got to talk about are a couple of brothers, Andrew and Thomas Kokoraleis. And we have some wonderful freaking names in this episode to talk about. So the Kokoraleis brothers grew up in Villa Park, Illinois, which is a quiet suburb about 20 miles west of Chicago. The family was Greek Orthodox. They were traditional, modest, and close-knit. There was no history of crime, no generational curse of violence, just ordinary people trying to make ends meet in the shadow of the city. So Thomas was born in 1860, and he was the oldest of the two boys. He was small, quiet, and slow to catch on in school. Teachers described him as polite, but easily confused, a boy who needed a little extra time and rarely raised his hand. His IQ was later measured at 75, low enough to make everyday life a little harder, but not low enough for any kind of formal intervention. His younger brother, Andrew, came along in 1963, and the pattern repeated. His IQ tested at 74. Same struggles, same isolation. They lived in a world that often moved too fast for them to follow. So growing up, neither of them had close friends. They weren't bullies and they weren't victims. They just were kind of background characters in the lives of everybody else. They spent time helping their parents, working small jobs, going to church on Sundays. And Villa Park was safe, predictable, and quiet, the kind of place where the loudest sound at night was the hum of passing traffic on Roosevelt Road. So neither Thomas or Andrew showed any signs of cruelty or rebellion. There were no arrests, no violence, no dark stories that were whispered behind their back. Thomas learned painting and he was an odd job laborer. Andrew drifted between short-term work, mostly menial tasks that didn't require any kind of decision-making or confrontation. Their lives followed a pattern of repetition, simplicity, work, church, family, sleep. And if you'd asked anyone who knew them, they'd have been described with the same phrase: nice boys who were just a little bit slow. So what they lacked, though, was independence. Both relied heavily on others to tell them what to do, how to act, what was right, what was wrong. And that passivity would later become their undoing. But at this stage in their lives, they were absolutely harmless. Just a couple of quiet young men shaped by their routine, sheltered from the harsher edges of Chicago life. There was nothing in their upbringing that pointed to murder, nothing that hinted at the brutality they'd one day be a part of. They were products of an ordinary life. And maybe that's what makes what came next so freaking terrifying, because monsters don't always begin as predators. Sometimes they begin as people who never learned how to say no.
Right.
So the next asshat that we have to talk about is
3.
Asset number 3, Edward Spreitzer. And Edward Spreitzer was born on January 5th, 1961 in Chicago. And his childhood never had a chance to be ordinary. He was raised by a teenage mother and overshadowed by a father who saw him as a disappointment. So he grew up chasing approval that he was never going to get. From an early age, he learned how to stay quiet, how to disappear into the corners of a room, how to make himself small enough not to be noticed. Teachers described him as shy, withdrawn, and disconnected. While other children played and formed friendships, Edward kept to himself, spending most of his time helping the school janitor rather than participating in class. His academic performance lagged so far behind that he eventually shared a grade level with his younger sister, a humiliation that carved into his already fragile self-esteem. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't defiant. He was simply lost. A boy out of step with the world, watching it from a distance. But by the time he reached high school, he'd already began to fade into the margins. His grades collapsed, and so did his sense of purpose. In his third year, he dropped out, trading classrooms for uncertainty. When he wrecked the family car at age 18, his father threw him out, and that was it. The last tether to stability had been severed. With nowhere else to go, Edward rented a room at the Bear Rabbit Motel in Villa Park, a place that would later become the quiet staging ground for some of the most horrific crimes in Chicago's history. He took a job at Winchell's Donuts, a forgettable stretch of late-night shifts and minimum wage. The people who knew him described him as timid, awkward, and eager to please, the kind of man who would do anything just to be included. Psychological testing would later label him with an IQ in the low 70s. Immature, impulsive, and simplistic. He displayed schizoid personality traits, struggling to connect with others and reacting to the world with bursts of nervous compliance rather than conviction. Edward was in every sense a man without direction. He wanted acceptance. He wanted purpose. He wanted someone to tell him who he was supposed to be. That's when he met Robin Gecht, a man 8 years older, confident, composed, and everything Edward wasn't. Their paths crossed at Winchell's Donuts, where Gecht would come in regularly, radiating a strange authority that drew Edward in. When Edward's car broke down one night, it was Gecht who offered him help. Fixing more than his engine, he gave him attention, validation, and the illusion of friendship. And from that point forward, Edward began orbiting Gecht's world. He moved into the same motel complex where the Kokoraleis brothers lived. Locals noticed them almost immediately. A group of quiet young men with strange routines, coming and going at odd hours, talking about things no one else could quite understand. Some called him cultish, others just called him off. But what no one realized was that Edward's lifelong need for acceptance had found its master. And under Robin Gecht, that quiet, rejected young man would become something else entirely. Not by nature, but by command. So the king asshat himself is Robin Gecht. Before the self-appointed prophet of Chicago's most sadistic cult, Robin Gecht was already a storm forming in quiet places. He was born in Menard, Illinois. He grew up in what most people would call a broken home, chaotic, cold, and full of rumors that still hang over his story today. Some accounts allege that as a boy, Gecht molested his younger sister, an act so disturbing that relatives sent him to live with his grandparents. Gecht denied it years later in prison letters, but whether the claim was true or just a rumor, it set the tone for everything else that followed. Shame, secrecy, and a fascination with power over others. As a teenager, he gravitated towards the occult, not the philosophical kind, but the theater of darkness, black candles, blood symbolism, and the idea that pain could open a doorway to control. Classmates remembered him as quiet but odd, someone who lingered on violent talk longer than anyone should. By the time most kids were planning their futures, Robin Gecht was building an identity around dominance, sex, and ritual. He learned his trade the ordinary way, through construction and electrical work. But even that path would later gain an unholy association. It's widely reported that Gecht briefly worked for John Wayne Gacy's PDM contractors in the late 1970s, a claim that Gecht would later deny. Whether they truly crossed paths or not, the shadow of Gacy added a layer of infamy that Gecht never managed to shake. Two predators, one city, and a chilling coincidence that made Chicago's underbelly feel like the gathering point for evil. Outwardly, he seemed settled, a married man with 3 children, a small house, a steady work, but behind closed doors, Gecht's world was anything but stable. Former partners described him as sadistic, a man who demanded control through pain. He turned intimacy into performance, insisting on acts that blurred sex and mutilation, asking women to stab or cut themselves to please him. His obsession with women's breasts bordered on mania. He told people it was a family trait, as if cruelty could be inherited. So by the time he met Edward Spreitzer at Winchell's Donuts, Gecht had mastered his disguise. He presented himself as confident, successful, even protective, the kind of older man a lost kid might look up to. Spreitzer, adrift and eager for belonging, saw in him a mentor. Gecht saw something else entirely, a mind that he could shape. Robin Gecht's early years read like a slow burn blueprint for what came next. Abuse, domination, performance, and an appetite for control that would eventually find its outlet in ritual murder. So by the time the red van started rolling through Chicago's streets, the stage was already set. The devil didn't find Gecht in 1981. Gecht had been building him all along. By the late 1970s, Gecht had perfected his mask. To the outside world, he was a husband, a father, an electrician with steady work. But behind that suburban facade, the rituals were already taking shape. Private rehearsals of power, pain, and control. And like every manipulator who craves an audience, Gecht soon began to gather followers. The lonely, the slow-witted, the ones who confused dominance with strength, they were drawn to him like moths to a quiet flame. It started small. A cup of coffee at a donut shop, a job offer, a ride home. But every gesture was calculated. By the time Edward Spreitzer stepped into his orbit and the Kokoraleis brothers followed, the blueprint was set. What began as influence would soon become obedience, and obedience would become blood. The creation of the Chicago Ripper crew didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a pact made in blood or a sudden decision to kill. It was a slow corrosion. One man's will bending three others until they became something unrecognizable. At the center of that transformation stood Robin Gecht. Gecht was older, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous than the men he surrounded himself with. His confidence had gravity. People like Edward Spreitzer and the Kokoraleis brothers mistook it for strength. What they couldn't see was that it wasn't confidence. It was control. So like I said earlier, it began at Witchel's Donuts in Villa Park, a place as ordinary as the evil that would grow from it. Spreitzer was working the counter after dropping out of school. He was broke. He was homeless. He was living at the Brer Rabbit Motel. Gecht was a regular customer, older, married, steady on the surface. To a man like Edward, Gecht looked like success, a job, a home, a wife, a sense of direction. So when Edward's car broke down that night, Gecht offered to help him. And that simple gesture, a ride, a favor, that became the hook. Soon, Edward was taking advice from Gecht, then rides, and then work. Gecht gave him something that he'd never had before, and that was approval. And approval became obedience. When Gecht hinted at special gatherings, Edward went along. When the violence started, he didn't question it. And by the time he was driving the red van on their first abductions, he had stopped thinking for himself altogether. The Kokoraleis brothers, Andrew and Thomas, came next. Slow, polite, and easily led, they had grown up in Villa Park too, and through loose social ties and occasional construction work, they found their way into Gecht's circle. Andrew was the youngest, barely out of his teens, and for a time even lived with Gecht's family. The closeness blurred the line between loyalty and fear. Both brothers, limited in intellect and desperate for belonging, accepted Gecht's authority as absolute. He didn't have to threaten them. His belief in his own power was threat enough. The four men, Gecht, Spreitzer, and the Kokoraleis brothers, began orbiting one another constantly. They rented adjoining rooms at the Rip Van Winkle or the Brer Rabbit Motel, which it's weird as shit to me. It's the same motel, but it goes by two different names.
Weird.
Depending on what sources you're looking at and stuff.
Like nicknames or actual legit names?
Actual legit names.
Huh.
One is the Brer Rabbit Motel, and the other one is the Rip Van Winkle Motel. I don't know.
Weird.
So anyway, so you rented rooms together, and then they just, the whole thing's weird as shit.
Yeah.
For somebody like me who hates people. That's the last thing I would want.
You don't hate people.
I hate being around people.
That's different than hating people.
I sure don't want to get no freaking adjoining rooms with somebody.
Exactly.
So anyway, the place seemed like it was kind of a shithole, honestly. And it was described as having like peeling paint and a reputation for noise. And none of these guys are making very damn much money. So I can imagine it was a shithole.
Right.
So locals called them party animals. They were men who drank too much and kept to themselves. But the manager thought that something else was happening. He'd seen the candles and the late night chanting and the way they carried themselves like soldiers waiting for orders. People whispered that they were devil worshippers. And this is during the time that, that was a huge thing.
Yeah.
Back in the 80s.
Yeah.
And not only were there a whole bunch of people, including Congress, that were going after all the devil worshippers and Satanists. This was a little before the satanic panic that would come along in 2 or 3 years.
Right.
But I can remember as a kid, this was the time when it was all backward masking in the rock music. They had satanic messages. If you played them backwards, you could hear the devil tell you to do all this kind of stuff. And
animals went missing.
Because you have all the parents that are telling their kids you can't listen to rock music. And this is like when Metallica was kicking off, AC/DC. And I can remember, because, I grew up during this time, same way you did. I can remember as a kid being told that AC/DC stood for After Christ Devil Pumps. Just shit like that.
Yeah.
And now as an electrician, I'm like, are you sure it didn't have something alternating and direct current? Because that kind of makes sense. But yeah, so this is during that time. And, if you grew up in that time period, it was like everywhere on both sides. It was parents and the adults and everything saying that all the kids were listening to Satan music. And it was like Footloose.
Yes, have to save the kids.
And then all the kids were rebelling, or not all the kids, but there was a huge group of kids that were rebelling against that Christian shit that was going on. And so they're like, oh, you want me to be a Satanist?
Yeah.
That's when like a lot of us got into.
If you're accusing me, I might as well just be it.
Well, yeah. And that was the time when like a lot of us first tried Ouija boards and all that kind of shit too.
Not yours truly.
Well, I did. And so that's kind of also what happened with, I can imagine, that's where Robin Gecht probably got exposed to this shit. Because now, first of all, it's way more accepted. Like it isn't this, oh my God, you're a Satanist. It's like, whatever, freak, get the hell away from me.
Exactly.
And then, like with Wiccans and shit like that, like, back then, if you were a Wiccan, you were a Satanist.
Yeah.
And now it's completely different.
Right.
So it has really changed. But at this time, Satanism was
terrible.
Yeah.
And it was terrible and all the bad things.
Right. Yep. So inside the motel rooms, Gecht cemented his rule. He spoke of Satan. He spoke of sacrifice. He spoke of power, of proving devotion through pain. And to the others, he was no longer just a man. He was a figure of fear and fascination. They believed that he could read minds and put curses on them, that he could even summon punishment from beyond. He reinforced it with ritual. A space carved out in the attic of his home was draped with symbols and candle lit, where he preached the theology of cruelty. So what began as talk soon turned into action. Gecht's obsession with control, sex, and blood merged into something ritualistic. He told his followers that they were chosen, that each act of violence brought them closer to understanding his truth. They believed him, they obeyed, and they followed him down a path that would stain Chicago forever.
Right.
So the Ripper Crew wasn't born from this sick shared desire. It was born from manipulation. It was a leader who knew exactly which buttons to press, and the three followers who never learned how to say no. The motel rooms in his freaking weird ass little attic became their church. The van became their altar. And under Robin Gecht's command, belief itself became a weapon. So in Chicago's dark folklore, there's a rumor that just refuses to die. And that's the claim that Robin Gecht once worked for John Wayne Gacy. So we have to talk about it. It's the kind of story that sounds too perfect to be coincidence.
Right.
Two sadists, both hiding behind construction jobs, both living in the same city, both turning their private obsessions into carnage. For years, the idea of their paths crossing has lingered like an echo in the city's criminal history. According to old police reports and later retellings, Gecht supposedly worked briefly as an electrician or subcontractor for Gacy's company, PDM Contractors, sometime in the late 70s. Right around the time that Gacy's crawl space was filling up with bodies.
Yeah.
The image of one monster learning from another was too intoxicating for the public to resist. It offered an explanation for how Gecht would become what he did, a student of evil taking lessons from a master. But when you peel back the rumor, the evidence starts to vanish. There's no payroll records, no employment logs, no photographs that placed them together or him on like Gacy's job sites or anything. Right. And the two men's victim profiles could not have been more different. Gacy preyed on boys and young men. Mm-hmm. He was gay.
Right.
Gecht on women, and he had a fascination with breasts. And while Gacy's crimes ended in 1978, Gecht's wouldn't begin until years later. So there's no overlap, no known overlap in their activity, only proximity and coincidence. So, and from prison, Gecht has flatly denied any connection. In letters and in interviews, he's claimed that the story was born from a detective's attempts to rattle the crew during interrogation.
Oh.
Some sarcastic comment that spiraled into myth, but it spread anyway. However it came from, it is out there. And I don't think there's any merit to it whatsoever. I mean, I think that, first of all, Gacy wasn't somebody that's going to take somebody under his wing and teach them how to kill. If Gecht would have been at Gacy's house, Gacy would have raped him and buried him in the space, or would have got him to dig the graves. I mean, there was some people that Gacy didn't kill, but...
Well, and Gecht's bad enough that if it was true, why would he deny it?
Yeah, exactly. You know, and...
I mean, what's he gaining from denying it if it's true?
Well, the guy's a whole asshat, so who the hell knows? But
I mean, true.
I mean, there's just nothing there that I could find that really gave any credence to it, except for the fact that you have two seriously sick sons of bitches operating in the same city within a couple years of each other. So they have to be connected, because as long as we can connect them, we can explain how this could possibly happen.
Right. Well, and their jobs were the same. And
Yeah. I mean, they both worked in construction. So, I mean, you know, their personalities were totally different.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Gacy was like the charismatic public leader. I mean, he was like the president of the JCs and shit, and everybody in town loved him. And, you know, Gecht was kind of family man and shit, but he was not like a politician. He was not out whining and dining with.
He wasn't dressing up like a clown.
And he wasn't dressing up like a clown. No. So I don't know. I don't think that there's really much about that, but I had to bring it up because, you know, it's out there. And then the other big difference between the two is, like I kind of alluded to before, Gacy was a lone predator. He was not taking somebody under his wing and showing him the ropes. And Gecht was completely different. Gecht was a manipulator. He was like a Charles Manson type of character.
He wouldn't have wanted to be the student.
Right. No,
he didn't have that capacity.
He was the leader.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. But a detective would later say that Gecht made Manson look like a Boy Scout. Now, I don't know about that, but I do know that his depravity compared to Manson, there's no comparison. Okay. Like Manson had no problem killing people or ordering people to be killed, but he wasn't driven by the thickness that you're going to learn about with Gecht. Gecht is one of the most depraved freaking lunatics I've ever freaking heard about. I mean, this guy, the sexual depravity that we have to talk about in these episodes is almost unmatched by anything I've ever heard. Wow. And you can't say that about Manson. Manson was an evil bastard, and he was scary for his ability to manipulate, but he wasn't fascinated. He wasn't a sadist. Mm-hmm. He didn't get sexual pleasure out of hurting other people.
Right.
It was just a means to an end. So.
Control.
Right. Yep. And I mean, I think that he maybe did have a belief that we were going to have a race war and that, you know, Blackie was going to kill Whitey and all of that.
I think he did have a belief that he was high about something. He was going to control something, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, he was so freaking strung out on LSD and everything all the time. I think he did believe that the Beatles were talking to him and all of that kind of shit. But his goal was not that of a sadist. He wasn't deriving pleasure from causing pain.
Gotcha.
And So to kind of sum this all up, the Gecht-Gacy connection, it just remains that. It's a story. It's a rumor. It's been repeated over and over again. But as we know, there can definitely be two freaking independent monsters working at exactly the same time in near proximity to each other and have nothing to do with each other.
Well, there was 3 million people there. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, a little bit later in the 80s, you're going to see that occurring in California where we had multiple serial killers working. We saw it all throughout the 70s, 80s, and some into the 90s where you had multiple serial killers working all at the same time.
It's not like they take roll. Oh, you're already here in Chicago? Okay, I'll move on.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And
I'll find somewhere else.
During this period of time where you had Ted Bundy, who was operating, you had John Wayne Gacy, who was operating, you had Dennis Rader, who was operating at that same time. And there was 4 or 5 more of them. I think that,
not to mention the tiny ones.
I think the dating game douchebag was operating right at this in this same period of time. Manson was just, a little bit earlier than these guys. And so this is the sweet spot for serial killers.
What about the Cecil Hotel guy? That was right about the same time too, wasn't it? What is his name? Ramirez.
Richard Ramirez. It was a little bit later. It was about the same time that Robin Gecht was killing. It was in the early 80s. But, during the late 70s and into the 80s, that was serial killer central in this country. So we had all kinds of them operating all at the same time. So every cult begins with a test. And that's a moment when belief becomes obedience and obedience becomes action. So for the men who followed Robin Gecht, that test came in May of 1981 with a woman named Linda Sutton. She was 31 years old, a mother of 2, and like so many of the Ripper Crew's eventual victims, she lived on the edges of Chicago's forgotten streets where poverty, addiction, and danger blurred together under the streetlights. To most, Sutton was invisible. To Robin Gecht, she was an opportunity, a sacrifice to prove control. So by then, Gecht had already chosen his student in Edward Spreitzer. Edward was still working nights at Winchell's Donuts, sleeping at the Brer Rabbit Motel, and clinging to the illusion that Gecht was his mentor. Gecht saw what he needed to see, a lonely, slow-witted guy desperate for approval who was the perfect recruit. So one night after closing, Gecht offered Spreitzer a ride, and the story goes that as the city rolled past outside the van's tinted windows, Gecht told him that they were going to, quote, pick up some whores. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command disguised as camaraderie. Spreitzer, who was uncomfortable and uncertain, did what he always did, and that's followed. He did what he was told. So when they found Linda Sutton, Gecht made his first move. He charmed her, offered her money, and then he dosed her. Spreitzer waited in the shadows of the van, half aware that something was wrong, but too afraid to act. When Gecht called him over, the order was simple: drag her body into the woods. So Spreitzer hesitated, and that's when Gecht began the lesson. Gecht didn't just kill for pleasure. He also killed for control. What he wanted wasn't blood, but allegiance. He forced Spreitzer to watch, to participate, to cross the line with him. The mutilation that followed wasn't random. It was ritual, a performance meant to shatter conscience and replace it with obedience. When it was over, Spreitzer wasn't just an accomplice. He was fully initiated. So that night marked the birth of the Ripper Crew. Gecht had proven that he could make another man commit the unthinkable. And once a person crosses that line, there's no going back. Spreitzer's silence afterward wasn't loyalty. It was fear, the kind of fear that binds a man to his tormentor. As the months passed, Gecht's reach expanded. He brought in the Kokoraleis brothers, Andrew and Thomas, both men of limited intellect, both eager to belong. And he told them that he had supernatural powers, that he could read their thoughts and control their bodies. even kill them without laying a hand on them. And they believed him. They said that he could put them into, quote, a trance. And if they disobeyed, they'd suffer his wrath. So what began as intimidation evolved into ritual. In the attic of Gecht's house, the same home where his wife and 3 children were sleeping,
Wow.
he built a shrine of candles and symbols, turning sexual violence into ceremony. The others said he called it, quote, the satanic altar. There, Gecht conducted his rituals of torture, rape, and mutilation, forcing his followers to take part in acts so brutal they would later describe them as, quote, commands from something not human. And this gets just vile, but
Yeah.
it just is what happened. So the victim's severed breast became the centerpiece of those rituals, tokens of devotion to the darkness that Gecht worshipped. They did consume parts of the flesh, a grotesque attempt to seal loyalty through shared desecration. Whether or not every detail is literal, the psychology behind it is clear. Gecht's control wasn't physical anymore. It was spiritual, or at least he made them believe that it was. The Kokoraleis brothers later said that they had no choice but to obey. Spreitzer said that he feared Gecht more than death. And Robin Gecht, the man they called the real one, had turned 3 men into willing instruments of his madness. The murder of Linda Sutton wasn't just the beginning of a killing spree. It was an initiation, a ritual of submission built to test loyalty, find obedience, and erase humanity. And from that moment on, they weren't 4 men sharing a secret. They were a cult, united by fear, violence, and the belief that their leader could control even their souls. So in talking about the murder of Linda Sutton, Spreitzer would later say that she was drugged and handcuffed, left helpless on the floor of the van. Gecht then raped her, and then he began to mutilate her body, slicing off one breast before forcing Spreitzer to watch and then to learn. He used piano wire to remove the other breast, explaining the process like a craftsman teaching a trade. He wasn't just killing her, he was training his disciple. Sutton's death was not quick. Gecht drew it out, turning agony into ceremony. And like I said before, the guy was a freaking sadist. So the more pain that he can inflict, the better.
Yeah.
So 10 days later, on June 1st of 81, the staff at the Brer Rabbit Motel complained about a foul odor that was coming from behind the property. And what they found was horror beyond description. Linda Sutton's body lay in a shallow patch of brush, decomposing in the early summer heat. Her hands were cuffed, a cloth gag stuffed into her mouth. Her pants and sweater were pushed up, her lower body exposed. The left breast had been amputated, the mutilation that would later mark every Ripper crew victim. The coroner noted that she had been dead only about 3 days, meaning she'd endured agony before death, and that decomposition had accelerated from the open wounds and the infestation that followed. It was a gruesome discovery, but at the time it barely made the news. Another murdered woman in a city already drowning in them. Police cataloged the scene, took photos, filed the report, and moved on. No one yet realized that this wasn't an isolated act of violence. It was the beginning of a sequence, methodical, ritualized, and spreading across Chicago's streets. So Linda Sutton's death established everything that would define the Ripper Crew. The red van, the bondage, the mutilation, and the signature desecration. It was murder as initiation, violence as instruction, and a city too overwhelmed to connect the dots. So Gecht had proven that he could command others to kill. Spreitzer had proven that he would obey. And in that dynamic, power, fear, submission, the machinery of the Ripper Crew began to turn. Linda Sutton's name deserves more than a footnote in their story. She was the first to fall victim to a system of control that weaponized faith, fear, and obedience. Her life, like too many others, became the proof of how far evil can go when no one is watching. And so I'm going to discuss the autopsy findings of Linda Sutton. And then as we move through the victims, I'm not going to do this on everyone.
Because it's the same.
It's pretty much the same, and it's freaking gruesome and
carbon
nasty,
copy.
and gross, and it's not some shit that I want to repeat over and over again. So
he's just going to let us know it's the same.
Yeah. So the official autopsy and coroner reports for Linda Sutton's murder offered investigators their first undeniable proof that the violence was not random, it was ritualistic. The filings, which were preserved in court records and medical testimony, documented the brutality with precision. The examination was performed by Dr. David Barrett, a director of pathology at Central DuPage Hospital. When he received the body, decomposition was advanced. The heat, the exposure, and the open wounds had accelerated decay far beyond what the timeline suggested. At first glance, the injuries seemed too severe. The entire anterior chest wall was gone. Both breasts were missing, and several of the ribs bore clean, linear cuts. Initially, Dr. Barrett assumed the damage came from animal activity, but as he cleaned and cataloged the remains, something didn't fit. The edges were symmetrical, the cuts precise, and the pattern consistent with amputation, not with tearing. Later, after reviewing photographs alongside investigative reports and the confessions that followed, Dr. Barrett concluded that what he'd seen wasn't decomposition at all. It was deliberate removal, perforated with a knife or a thin wire. The wounds terminated in uniform lines, each incision ending abruptly, as if drawn by design. That pattern would become the Ripper Crew's signature. The autopsy confirmed that the crime scene had only hinted at. Linda Sutton had been raped, handcuffed, gagged, and mutilated before death. The coroner ruled that she died from multiple stab wounds and subsequent blood loss, with the mutilation of her chest occurring while she was still alive. The findings became the backbone of the prosecution's case later, and the physical proof that tied the confessions to fact. So during the trial, the state's attorney introduced Dr. Barrett's testimony along with corroborating statements from the crew's own members to demonstrate intent and ritual. Investigators emphasized the symmetry of the wounds and the post-mortem positioning of the body, clear evidence that this wasn't some frenzied violence, but a practiced, repeated act. Each point aligned with the suspect's own accounts of Gecht's instructions and the use of wire to sever the breast during the ritual. Despite the condition of the body, Dr. Barrett estimated that Sutton had been dead only about 3 days when she was found, meaning her body had lain exposed for a week before discovery. The rapid decomposition, he explained, was caused by the size of the open wounds, which allowed maggot infestation and tissue breakdown far faster than usual. The conclusion was inescapable. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was a structured act of cruelty. The precision of the cuts, the ritualistic removal, and the post-mortem presentation all pointed to an offender or offenders operating from doctrine and not from rage. Linda Sutton's autopsy didn't just reveal how she died. It revealed how they thought, the method, the order, the deliberate performance of violence that was meant to bind a group through shared desecration. It was the first forensic glimpse into the anatomy of the Ripper Crew's madness. So after the murder of Linda Sutton in May of '81, something shifted. The Ripper Crew was no longer a handful of men circling Chicago's shadows for victims. They had become a system, a hierarchy, a cult. And at its center was Robin Gecht, the architect, the freaking lunatic, the piece of shit, Captain Asshat. This guy just disgusts me.
I can't tell.
Oh, God, he's something there. So the murder of Sutton wasn't just an act of violence. It was a ceremony of control. And for Edward Spreitzer, it was baptism by blood. The moment that Gecht proved dominance through terror. And for Andrew and Thomas Kokoraleis, who joined soon after, it was the point of no return. They entered Gecht's circle not as equals, but as believers. Men with limited understanding, desperate for belonging, and too afraid to question the man who promised them purpose. At the Rip Van Winkle Motel, sometimes called the Brer Rabbit Motel, explain that shit to me, I don't know. The transformation became visible. The men, like I said, rented adjoining rooms, coming and going at odd hours, the air heavy with smoke and secrecy. And, for the staff, for the people there, they had to have been like, who are these freaking lunatics? Burning candles and chanting and doing all this weird ass shit So by the start of 1982, the Ripper Crew's violence had begun to follow a rhythm, a gruesome cycle of hunting, ritual, desecration. The killing of Linda Sutton had set their pattern, and now the pattern was spreading. So on February 12th of 82, a 35-year-old cocktail waitress was driving home when her car ran out of gas on a Chicago area freeway. When police later found her abandoned vehicle, the doors were unlocked, the keys were still inside. Hours later, her nude body was discovered along an embankment nearby, discarded like waste, but marked by the unmistakable brutality that had come to define the crew. She'd been raped, tortured, and mutilated, her breast amputated with precision. It was the same ritual cut that investigators would come to recognize again and again. Detectives kept the amputation secret from the press, using it as an identifying marker, a private thread to connect otherwise disconnected bodies that were beginning to appear around Chicago. The hope was that by withholding that detail, it might help isolate the killer when the next victim surfaced, but the next victim came quickly. Days later, police found the body of another woman, an unidentified Hispanic female, wearing an engagement ring. She'd been raped, strangled, and left nude, the assault clearly sexual in nature, but ritual in tone. Unlike the earlier victims, her breasts had not been removed. Instead, they bore deep bite marks, chewed and torn by human teeth. Forensic reports described the injuries as severe, and investigators noted the presence of semen on her body, evidence that the killer had masturbated over her corpse after death. These were the first signs of what profilers would later describe as escalation through experimentation. The violence was increasing in both frequency and in complexity. The mutilations were changing, the ritual evolving. Whether Gecht was testing new forms of control or simply refining his own depravity, each crime carried a signature of purpose, something deliberate, practiced, and personal. Both of these women, their names largely lost to the public record, became the invisible victims of a transformation. So between Sutton's death in 1981 and Lori Borowski's abduction in May of 82, which we'll be getting to, the Ripper Crew had evolved from predators into priests of their own perverse religion. And by the time the next killing came, they no longer hunted for impulse or for pleasure. They hunted for worship. And I think that applies for everybody but Gecht, because I think Gecht was a true sadist and he was getting all kinds of pleasure out of all of this.
If you need a slight break from the depravity, I have an answer for you.
On?
The name of the hotel.
Okay, shoot.
So it says, and this is according to the AI overview, the Brer Rabbit Motel in Chicago was also called the Rip Van Winkle because its owner was known for being very lazy. And the name Rip Van Winkle was used to describe people who were oblivious or seemed to be in a permanent state of sleep. The nickname likely played on the story of the character who slept for 20 years, implying the owner was similarly lazy and inactive. The owner's perceived laziness was a direct reason for the nickname, and the hotel was named after a famous character associated with prolonged sleep and inactivity. So that's why it moved. And it's known as both, because the owner was a lazy lazy man.
And so that just pretty well describes the conditions at the place.
Exactly.
It was a shithole.
Exactly.
Awesome.
So I put some things together, back to the depravity.
Well, thank you very much for that, because it was curious.
It was, and I wanted to know.
And when you're researching it, it doesn't say, like, sometimes referred to as, it's like some reports say the Rip Van Winkle Hotel, other reports say the Brer Rabbit, and you're like, yeah.
So
awesome.
When I can find things, I will find them.
Well, I appreciate it. So by the spring of 82, the Ripper crew had become a machine. Its rituals perfected, its hierarchy fixed, its violence accelerating. The death of Lorraine, or Lori Ann Borowski, would mark both the peak of their cruelty and the beginning of their undoing. So on May 15, 1982, in Elmhurst, Illinois, which was a quiet suburban town, the kind of place where nothing truly bad was supposed to happen, Lori Borowski was 21, full of life and known for her easy laugh and unshakable kindness. She worked at a small real estate office on York Road and had walked to work that morning the way that she always did, her purse on her shoulder, a few minutes early, ready to unlock the door. When her coworkers arrived, they found the front steps covered in her belongings, her shoes, her keys, makeup, and a can of hairspray scattered across the sidewalk as if it had been dropped in a struggle, but Lori was gone. Witnesses later reported seeing a reddish-orange van parked nearby, the same color and shape that had appeared in scattered reports across Chicago's west suburbs. At the time, it was just another van on another morning. Only later would it become infamous. The abduction was carried out by Edward Spreitzer and Andrew Kokoraleis, acting under Robin Gecht's orders. According to their confessions, they took Lori to a secluded spot. Some versions say a wooded area, others say a cemetery. And what followed was not just murder. It was torture dressed as ritual. This poor girl was repeatedly raped, stabbed more than 80 times with an ice pick, and mutilated while she was still alive. Again, her left breast was severed with wire, the act Gecht reserved as his personal signature. Spreitzer would later tell investigators that Gecht performed a sexual act with the severed tissue, completing what he called the ceremony. Some accounts mention broken bones, suggesting sustained violence, not frenzy, but endurance, and then silence. For nearly 5 months, her family searched, prayed, and hoped. Flyers went up, the van description circulated, but no leads came. Then on October 10th, 1982, a groundskeeper in a Clarendon Hills cemetery discovered a shallow grave. Inside lay the decomposed remains of a young woman. Her body had been buried hastily, the soil thin and uneven despite the passage of time. The violence was still visible, the stab wounds, the mutilation, the unmistakable pattern that matched Sutton's autopsy. She was identified as Lorraine Borowski by her jewelry and fragments of her clothing. The coroner could not pinpoint a single cause of death. Decomposition had erased any precision, but the evidence was overwhelming. Torture, multiple freaking stab wounds, mutilation, and extreme sexual assault. The cruelty spoke for itself. Investigators now knew this was not an isolated killing. It was the continuation of something larger and something organized. The murder of Lori Borowski exposed the Ripper crew's full evolution. It wasn't impulsive anymore. It was patterned. It wasn't rage. It was ritual. And for the first time, the public began to glimpse the scale of the nightmare moving beneath the suburban Chicago. Lorraine Borowski had been everything the crew was not. Kind, open-hearted, trusting. Her murder shattered the illusion that evil only hunted in dark alleys and forgotten neighborhoods. In Elmhurst, on a clear morning in May, it had found daylight. The Ripper crew had crossed another line, and the investigation that would eventually expose them had just begun. Then 2 weeks after the disappearance of Lori Borowski, the Ripper crew struck again. Their next victim was Shui Mok, 30 years old, recently arrived from China and just beginning to find her place in the American Midwest. She was bright, determined, and trying to balance family expectations with a new life in Illinois. On May 29, 1982, all of that ended on a roadside in Hanover Park. That evening, Shui was returning home from the family's restaurant in Streamwood, riding with her brother. The two reportedly got into an argument, some kind of a family dispute about her sister's wedding to an American, and in frustration, her brother stopped the car and let her out. He assumed their relatives who were following behind in another vehicle would pick her up, but that second car never came. And what came instead was the Ripper crew's red van. Inside were Robin Gecht, Edward Spreitzer, and the Kokoraleis brothers. They pulled up beside her, offered her a ride, and when she hesitated, Gecht's charm took over. That confident, disarming tone that had lured women before. Shui accepted, stepping unknowingly into a nightmare. The cruelty began immediately. They hurled racist slurs at her, mocking her accent, turning hatred into fuel. When she fought back, they beat her unconscious, then dragged her deeper into the van. Spreitzer used a length of wire to choke her while Gecht struck her repeatedly, his rage spilling into ritual. They drove her to a remote construction site where the violence reached its peak. What happened next mirrored the pattern of Linda Sutton's murder, but with an even greater frenzy. Gecht sliced off her breast, the act he turned into both symbol and sacrament, and then raped the open wounds, repeating the desecration he had inflicted on other victims. This time, there was no ceremony in the attic, no candles, no recitation from the Satanic Bible. The attack was chaotic, rushed, and overflowing with sadism. When it was over, Shui Mok lay broken in the dirt, multiple skull fractures, 2 shattered ribs, and a severed forearm. She had been beaten, mutilated, raped, and left to die where she fell. Her body wasn't found until September 30th of 82, 4 months later, when construction workers uncovered human remains at a job site less than a mile from where she'd last been seen. Investigators described the scene as catastrophic. The remains bore the same ritual mutilation as the earlier victims, deep slashes, missing tissue, and the signature post-mortem injuries that had become unmistakably tied to the crew. One officer told reporters that her body looked as if she'd been, quote, sliced to ribbons. For investigators, the discovery confirmed what they feared most, that the crew's killing cycle had accelerated. Each victim was attacked faster than the last. The rituals performed more brutally. The control Gecht exerted over the others more absolute. There was no pretense of restraint anymore. The Ripper crew had crossed fully into mania. For Shui Mok, a woman who came to America seeking a better life, her death became another proof of the crew's depravity, a crime that fused racial hatred, sexual sadism, and cult ritual into one horrifying act. So by late 1982, the pattern was undeniable. Chicago wasn't facing a single killer. It was facing a collective, bound by blood and belief. And the next woman they targeted would survive, but only barely. And her courage would bring their darkness into light. So by the summer of 82, fear had begun to ripple quietly through Chicago's western suburbs, and another woman crossed paths with the Ripper crew. Her name was Angel York, and her survival would mark one of the first cracks in Robin Gecht's armor. So in June of 1982, Angel York was walking the streets of Chicago when a red van slowed to a crawl beside her. Behind the wheel sat Robin Gecht, his eyes fixed on her like prey. Inside were Edward Spreitzer, and the Kokoraleis brothers, the same men who'd already murdered Linda Sutton, Lorraine Borowski, and Shui Mock. York didn't know their names, but she recognized danger. Before she could run, the sliding door opened and the crew dragged her inside. She was handcuffed immediately, wrists pulled tight together, and forced to the floor. Then came the psychological torture that defined Gecht's control. He handed her a knife and told her to cut off her own breast. When she hesitated, he promised to kill her. York later told investigators that she began to comply, shaking, terrified, trying to survive 1 second at a time. I mean, the depravity of this shit is unreal.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like I hate these movies, but those freaking Saw movies taken to the ninth degree, you know, I mean, but before she could actually act and cut her own breast off, Gecht, overcome with his own frenzy, ripped the knife from her hand and stabbed her in the chest. The attack escalated into the crew's signature ritual. Gecht sexually assaulted the wound, masturbating into the open flesh and ejaculating as the others watched. When he was finished, someone pressed duct tape over the wound as if sealing in the ritual or some weird shit. I don't know.
What?
And then they opened the van door and threw her into the street, bleeding and broken, and expected her to die where she landed. But Angel York did not die. A passerby found her minutes later and rushed her to the hospital, where she underwent emergency surgery and survived against all odds.
Dang.
When detectives arrived to take her statement, she was coherent enough to speak, and what she described gave police their first real break. She told them about the red van, the tinted windows, the wooden divider, and even the strange little details like feathers and a roach clip hanging from the rearview mirror. It was the kind of description that only a survivor could give, and one that would later match exactly the van registered to Robin Gecht. York's testimony also confirmed something investigators had only suspected, and that was that this was a crew. It was not a lone predator. Multiple attackers, a shared method, a repeating pattern of ritual mutilation, which is so weird and odd and unheard of in the annals of true crime. Like, I'm not saying that it's never happened. Of course it has.
Right.
But it is rare. And for it to be, we already talked about like the Mansons, for it to be a group that is killing in a sexually sadistic way, it is very, very, very odd. Like I just off the top of my head, I can't think of another example. I mean, pairs, there's a few pairs, but as far as like a group, these guys are like all on their own. So Angel York had seen the structure of their violence from the inside, the hierarchy, the obedience, the way that they waited for Gecht's signal before doing anything. Her survival turned rumor into certainty. The city wasn't dealing with a serial killer. It was dealing with a ritualistic cult operating out of a red van, prowling for women like her. Angel York's name rarely appears on the same lists as the murdered women of the Ripper crew, but her endurance was every bit as defining. She was living proof of what they were and what they could no longer hide. So by late summer of '82, the Ripper crew's violence had reached a fever pitch. Their failed attempts at restraint and the near exposure from Angel York's survival hadn't slowed them down. If anything, it made them more determined to prove their devotion to Robin Gecht's twisted ritual. Their next victim was Sandra Delaware, who was just 18 years old. On August 28, 1982, the quiet along the Chicago River was broken by something unspeakable. Police responding to a call found the nude body of a young woman lying on the riverbank, wrists tied tightly behind her back with a shoelace, and her own bra wrapped around her throat, the makeshift ligature used to strangle her. The location was isolated, shielded by overgrown brush and train tracks, the kind of forgotten place where predators feel invisible. She had been dead only a few hours. Investigators would soon identify her as Sandra Delaware, a teenager adrift in the city, described by some as a runaway and by others as a young sex worker, and both of which could be true.
Right.
Whatever her circumstances, she had become the latest target in the crew's escalating ritual. The autopsy would reveal that she had been stabbed multiple times with the pattern of wounds indicating torture before death. And once again, the signature mutilation was there. Her left breast had been cleanly amputated. Andrew Kokoraleis would later confess, and it was supported by forensic evidence, that the men had forced a rock into her mouth to stifle her screams, a cruel detail confirmed by the coroner, and that they then stabbed and sexually assaulted her, forcing a wine bottle inside of her body, causing severe internal trauma and bleeding that was noted during the autopsy. And finally, they strangled her with her bra and then performed the ritual amputation that Gecht demanded of every quote-unquote offering. The attack showed all the hallmarks of their pattern: prolonged torture, sexual violence, and post-mortem mutilation, each step choreographed to mimic Gecht's so-called religious rites. What began with one woman in 1881 had now become full-blown liturgy. Every wound had meaning to him, every desecration a sermon. For investigators, Delaware's murder was confirmation that the crew was still active, still hunting. The consistency of method, the precision of the mutilation, and the physical evidence tied her death directly to the same group responsible for Borowski, Mock, and Sutton. So the Ripper crew had refined their violence into ritual, cruelty into ceremony, and as the investigation closed in, their devotion to Gecht's control only deepened. Sandra Delaware's death stood as both tragedy and a turning point. It proved that the crew's crimes weren't about lust or opportunity. They were about belief, about performance, and about power. So by early summer of 82, Chicago had become the hunting ground of a cult that thrived on pain. Each killing had been worse than the last, more deliberate, more performative, more ritualized. And for Rose Beck Davis, a 30-year-old marketing executive walking along Rush Street that night, it would mean the most sadistic killing of all. On September 7th, 1982, Rose Davis was heading home after an evening downtown when the red van pulled alongside her. Inside were Robin Gecht, Spreitzer, and Andrew Kokoraleis. According to Andrew's later confession, they were cruising for someone to offer to Gecht's weird-ass sick ritual, and Davis became that someone. They grabbed her off the street, forced her into the van, driving through the city's night until they reached an alley behind a Lakeshore Drive apartment. There, Davis's ordeal began. She was restrained and beaten with a savagery that surpassed even the crew's prior acts. Her face was shattered, her nose broken into fragments, and a black sock or stocking was pulled around her neck, and it was used to strangle her until she lost consciousness. Her wrists bore deep ligature marks, her sweater pushed up, and her slacks and underwear pulled to her ankles, exposing her for what was coming next. The assault on Rose Davis was prolonged, frenzied, and ritualized. Gecht raped her while the others held her down, and then, in an act that the prosecutors later called beyond all comprehension, he struck her in the face with a hatchet. When she fell, he used the handle of the same hatchet to penetrate her body with such force that the wooden handle pierced her abdomen. Later, it would be discovered embedded deep inside her during the autopsy. Her breasts were slashed, deep cuts running from her armpits inward, the incisions matching the surgical patterns seen in the other victims. She suffered multiple stab wounds, small puncture marks, and split skin across her chest and abdomen. Bruises covered her body, her back, wrists, and midsection, all showing signs of restraint and repeated blows. Blood pooled beneath her body, and spatter marked the wall beside her, evidence of the brutality and the duration of the murder. I mean, these are horrible enough without even talking about. I told you I was going to skip all the autopsy details.
Yeah.
It's bad enough just explaining what the freak happened without going into all of the details.
Some of them are just a little bit different.
Right. Yeah. So from the first night Linda Sutton was dragged into the woods, the Ripper crew wasn't a group of equals. It was a hierarchy built on fear, a cult of violence led by a man who understood how to twist weakness into obedience. So as we said, at the top was asshat number 1, Robin Gecht, and he was the oldest of the group. And he put this together, because we talked about it when we were talking about Simon Sue, when we were talking about how they know exactly who to pick. They're great profilers. And, he picked, none of these guys are freaking very smart. They're all IQs in the low 70s, so they're struggling mentally anyway. And man, he zeroed right in on that, put them together. And then after the murder of Linda Sutton, his control just deepened. And he told them that he possessed supernatural power. And we talked about all that. He could murder them with his mind.
Not even touching them.
Yeah. And so as the murders continued, the violence turned methodical, choreographed almost to ceremony. And then in the attic of Gecht's home, we already talked about it. He set up this satanic chapel up there. And it was a shrine of red light and candles and ritual where the acts of mutilation were reenacted under the pretense of devotion. So they would all gather around what Gecht called an altar. Mm-hmm. There, he would read from the Satanic Bible, which is a dumbass book written by a dumbass moron, Anton LaVey, who's a total freaking loser, dumbass.
I could think LaVey, but I couldn't remember the first name.
He is such an idiot. He is such a phony.
And doing all this while still being a husband and father.
His kids are playing downstairs.
And they're none the wiser.
Yeah. Or he was raising them up to be.
But the wife, what?
Maybe
what was she doing?
I don't know.
Okay, anyway.
So then he would read from the Satanic Bible, and then he would direct them to perform a grotesque communion with the severed remains of their victims.
Yeah.
So for the followers, the rituals blurred the boundary between reality and nightmare. Each session deepened their dependency and erased what little individuality they had left. What started as fear became faith, not spiritual faith, but faith in the authority of a man who demanded obedience through horror. The progression from 81 through 82 shows a clear psychological descent. In the beginning, hesitation marked the crime. Spreitzer and the brothers flinched, deferred, or looked away, but repetition dulled their reactions. With each abduction, Sutton, Borowski, Mock, Delaware, Gecht's lessons became more rehearsed, his command sharper, and the group more efficient. What had once been shocking became routine. Abduction, rape, mutilation, disposal, and ritual.
Yeah, they knew what he wanted and they just
the more you see it, then just the next one. So the crew stopped seeing victims as people. They were symbols. They were offerings. And the acts themselves became a twisted form of affirmation. Gecht fed on domination. Spreitzer fed on approval. And the Kokoraleis brothers fed on fear. Together, that triad of needs formed a closed system, self-sustaining, self-reinforcing, and entirely disconnected from the moral world outside. So by mid-82, the four men, we'd already said so Gecht was a little bit odd. He had a house.
A little bit? Okay.
The way that Gecht lived was a little bit odd.
Thank you.
So he had a life in the suburbs with his wife and his kids or whatever.
Well, yeah.
But then he was also spending nights at the Rip Van Winkle, Rare Rabbit, whatever freaking motel. And then they would have their weird ass ritual, whatever freak you want to call it, kind of in both places.
I know. I can't figure it out.
It's weird, but I mean, he did with them. It's so funny because we just ended up covering Simon Sue, and it wasn't on purpose that these were so closely together. But just like Simon Sue, he isolated these guys.
Yeah.
So they were
even more than they were.
Right. They rarely interacted with outsiders. And those who knew them described them as secretive, nocturnal, and off. Yeah.
Just off.
Yeah.
Okay.
But, nobody knew they were killing people.
Well,
they were just weird, and you hear that so many times, these serial killers, they're like, it really wasn't, that bad guy or whatever. He was just a little off.
It's just weird. Yeah.
And it's just a little
felt something
not right.
Yeah.
But, like I said, the isolation was deliberate. Gecht kept them dependent financially, emotionally, and psychologically, which ensured that their only sense of belonging would come from him and the violence that he orchestrated. So by the time that Rose Davis was murdered in September of 82, the transformation was complete. What had began as one man's depravity and three followers' fear had hardened into a ritualized killing order. Gecht was the unchallengeable leader. His commands were absolute. Spreitzer had become his eager apprentice, desperate to prove his loyalty, and the Kokoraleis brothers functioned as silent accomplices, performing their parts with mechanical obedience. Their empathy was gone, their fear redirected inward, and their shared crimes had fused them together in a bond of contamination and secrecy. Within the small circle, there was no morality, there was no friendship, and there was no escape. Only hierarchy, superstition, this weird-ass devil worship bullshit religion thing that he cooked up. I'm not saying like the devil worship doesn't exist or whatever.
Right.
I'm telling you, this dipshit just made this shit up out of thin air.
This menu of it was made up by him.
Yes. And, I bring up like Anton LaVey and the Satanic Church and the Book of Satan and all, because it was all just a bunch of bullshit. It was the same thing. It was just cooked up out of this lunatic's freaking mind. I'm not saying there's not true Satanists out there. And I'm not saying that there's not really evil. Like, what's his nuts? Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley is a far more devoted evil Satanist than Anton LaVey ever was. And Anton LaVey was all in it for the publicity. But Aleister Crowley was in it because he believed a lot of that shit, So I don't know.
He wanted to be Satan, didn't he?
Well, he called himself the B666.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but I mean, his beliefs were a lot of metaphysical shit and stuff. I mean, you really almost have to do LSD to try to read his books. I've read a couple of them, but you're like, what is this? What is this guy talking about? It's all over the place. But anyway, sorry, get off on a tangent. It's just.
It's not you're describing that they're writing their own recipes.
Well, it's just, they're just making this shit up. It's not like, the Pope sends down a rule to the bishops and the bishop. It's not like that. It's like these lunatics just make this shit up. And just because they read from the Satanic Bible, it's just a book that they came across. Yeah. It could have been one of 100,000 satanic books that have been written over the years. It just happened to be Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible.
They're also interpreting it the way they want to.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah. And so, I don't know. But this was the Ripper crew in its purest form. Not four killers acting together, but one man's will imposed on three lost souls. Bound by blood, ritual and terror, a self-contained cult operating unseen in the shadows of Chicago. So in the year between Linda Sutton's screams in the dark and Rose Davis's body found in an alley off Lakeshore Drive, Chicago changed. Not on its skyline or its streets, but in the quiet space between them, where women disappeared one after another, while the city slept through the sound. What began with one woman left handcuffed in the weeds behind a motel evolved into something colder, sharper, and infinitely darker. A group of men, 3 followers and 1 leader, drifting from job sites and donut shops into a nightmare that would come to define a generation of fear. They didn't stalk their victims for money. They didn't kill out of panic or opportunity. They killed because their leader told them to do it. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling truth of all. How easily the human will can be broken, bent, and trained to serve someone else's darkness. From the outside, they looked ordinary. Spreitzer, the quiet one. The Kokoraleis brothers, simple, polite, forgettable. And Robin Gecht, the man with the calm smile and the wife at home. The man who preached Satan by candlelight and wore decency like a mask. Together, they formed a cult without scripture, a church without salvation. They believed they'd found power. What they'd really found was mutual destruction. The city never saw them coming. Different suburbs, different jurisdictions, different names on case files, all orbiting the same red van, the same ritual, the same absence of mercy. And as each woman vanished, Sutton, Borowski, Mock, Delaware, Davis, the pattern deepened, invisible only because no one dared to imagine it could exist. Behind closed doors in that attic where Gecht built his altar and the 4 of them rehearsed their blasphemy over and over, each ritual stripped away another layer of humanity until they were no longer men at all, but extensions of his will, moving through Chicago's shadows like apostles of cruelty. By the end of 1982, the killings had become second nature. Method, routine, habit. The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. And the ritual was complete. For the women who crossed their path, there was no pattern to avoid, no safe street to choose. There was only timing, the worst kind imaginable. And for law enforcement, there was only confusion. Too many victims, too few connections, and a silence thick enough to hide monsters. In this part of the story, there is no justice yet, only blood, secrecy, and 4 men who believed their shared depravity bound them forever. The Ripper crew was not finished, not by a long stretch. But by the fall of 1982, their transformation was complete. They had become something far beyond a gang of killers. They were a brotherhood of terror, a pact in blood and silence. Before the police reports and the trial transcripts, before the headlines about satanic murder and ritual mutilation, there were women, daughters, mothers, sisters, trying to make their way through the world. Each of them had routines, laughter, small struggles that should never have ended the way they did. Tonight, before we close, their names deserve to be spoken as more than footnotes of horror stories. They were the reason that this story matters at all. Linda Sutton. Linda Sutton was 20-something, a young mother raising 2 children in a hard city. She juggled survival, family, and the kind of daily uncertainty that doesn't leave much room for rest. She was flawed, yeah, like all of us, but she loved her kids fiercely, and her mother never stopped waiting for her to come home. When her body was found behind the Brer Rabbit Motel, she was reduced in the papers to a, quote, known prostitute. But she was more than the shorthanded circumstance. She was a woman trying to keep her family fed, living day to day in a city that judged survival more harshly than sin. She should have been given safety. Instead, she became the first victim of a group of men who mistook cruelty for power. The unnamed victims of February 82. In February 1982, 2 more women vanished into the same darkness. One, a 35-year-old cocktail waitress whose car ran out of gas on the freeway, was found discarded on an embankment, her body bearing the unmistakable mark of the cruise ritual. The second, a young Hispanic woman wearing an engagement ring, was found only days later, raped and strangled, her body left desecrated in ways too cruel to repeat. Their names were never released, their stories reduced to evidence numbers and morgue tags. But they mattered. They laughed with friends, made plans, fell in love, and expected to see tomorrow. They never did. Lori Ann Borowski. Lori Borowski was 21, bright-eyed and quick to laugh. The morning she vanished, she was unlocking the real estate office where she worked. A simple, ordinary start to an ordinary day. When her coworkers arrived, her shoes and her keys were scattered across the sidewalk, as if she'd been lifted off the earth mid-step. Her family searched for months. They never stopped believing that she'd come back. When her body was found 5 months later, buried in a shallow grave, the pain didn't end. It calcified into something permanent. Lori's story is one of stolen potential, of a young woman whose life was ripped away before it even began to take shape. Shui Mak. Shui Mak was 30, new to America, and working to build a better life for her family. She spoke limited English, but she worked long hours at her family's restaurant, saving what she could, adjusting to a country that promised opportunity. The night she died, she was arguing with her brother, the kind of family disagreement that feels huge in the moment and small in hindsight. Minutes later, she was gone. Her remains were found months later at a construction site, her body mutilated beyond recognition. Shui Mak's death carried a cruel irony. She came to America chasing safety and freedom, and instead found monsters hiding in its quiet suburbs. Angel York. Angel York lived, and that survival is a kind of defiance. She endured what no one should: torture, mutilation, the edge of death, and somehow she still had the strength to crawl towards light. Her body bore the evidence that tied the Ripper crew to its pattern of ritual violence. Her testimony gave investigators something tangible to chase. But beyond the courtroom, she carried scars that never healed. Survival is not the same as peace, but Angel's courage gave voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. Sandra Delaware. Sandra Delaware was 18, barely an adult. Her life was uncertain, her circumstances unstable, a teenager who'd slipped through society's cracks. But she was still a kid, one who deserved a chance to figure it out. When her body was pulled from the banks of the Chicago River, her hands bound, her throat strangled by her own bra, and her body violated in every imaginable way, the brutality stunned even hardened detectives. Sandra Delaware's death was not just a murder. It was a message. It marked the crew's complete descent into ritualized cruelty and the loss of yet another young woman who deserved far better than to be remembered for the violence done to her. Rose Davis. Rose Davis was 30, a marketing executive, successful, confident, alive in the city's nightlife. On September 7, 1982, she vanished from Rush Street, not far from where she worked, not far from home. Her body found the next day, beaten, stabbed, and mutilated in ways to defy belief. In her case, the cruelty reached its peak, every act a reflection of power and hatred, not passion or impulse. Rose Davis's murder was the final echo in a summer of horror, the point where the violence could no longer be ignored. She was not a symbol or a statistic. She was a woman with a career, friends, and a future, and she was taken because 4 men believed they could play God with other people's lives. These women, known and unknown, are more than the sum of the crew's atrocities. They were individuals who deserved protection, compassion, and a world that paid attention when danger first began to stir. Their stories remind us that evil often hides in plain sight, behind ordinary faces, in quiet neighborhoods, under the hum of fluorescent lights and the hum of denial. For every victim we can name, there are others whose stories never reach the headlines. To them, too, we owe remembrance and an unflinching promise that their pain will not fade into the margin of Chicago's history. This episode is dedicated to the memory of the women whose lives were stolen by the Ripper crew. May their names be spoken, their stories remembered, and their silence never repeated. The story of the Ripper crew is one of control, ritual, and power, and of the lives stolen along the way. We just walked through how 4 men twisted belief into violence, how fear became a binding force, and how ordinary Chicago streets turned into hunting grounds. But before we move forward, it's worth remembering something important. Behind every case file lies a human being, and behind every horror like this, there's a chance to stop the next one.
It's a lot to take in, John. Hearing this for the first time tonight, I keep thinking about all the missed signals, all the places where someone might have spoken up or stepped in, and it makes you wonder how different things could have been.
And that right there is why we do this. To talk about the cases that haunt small towns and big cities alike, because silence never protects anyone. Bringing light to what's been hidden, that is the heart of Dark Dialogue.
And it's why the work continues long after we stop recording. So if you believe in what we're doing and telling these stories and honoring these victims, you can support the show on Patreon, Ko-fi, or through our Substack newsletter. We share extended case files, bonus episodes, behind-the-scenes updates, and the fieldwork that goes into each investigation.
You can also join the Dark Dialogue Collective, our boots-on-the-ground network of researchers, volunteers, analysts, and listeners committed to pushing cold cases forward. And if you want to take an even more personal step, visit our Adopt a Victim program. There, you can help keep a victim's story alive through research, advocacy, and real-world support.
All the links are on darkdialogue.com, including ways to listen, subscribe, and follow every show across the Dark Dialogue network. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube for updates, episode drops, and behind-the-scenes content.
And if you have information, tips, questions, theories, or just something on your mind about a case, email us at info@darkdialogue.com. Every message matters, every connection matters, every story matters.
Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Remember the victims, learn from the past, and never stop asking questions.
Because it's only by facing the darkness that we can understand it. Until next time, I'm John.
And I'm Angela, and this is Dark Dialogue.
Stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep the dialogue alive.